This is the last session of the training. We're going to have a brief wrap up. And so that'll be that. Today, the topic that we will be addressing and discussing are agreements and how to manage conflict of interest in technology transfer. So this is the last block of the 4-block program that we developed for this workshop. And I'm very, very excited and very much looking forward to listening to the keynote presentation on this. So without further ado, I'm going to share the floor with Janine Chanson from Sarina, who you all also know by now. And Janine was going to give us a brief overview of what we're going to be listening to today. And then she will directly share the floor with Dr. Andrew Bailey, who's going to be doing the presentation today on management of conflict of interest and agreements as part of technology transfer. So Janine, over to you.
Thanks, Carlos. So just a reminder that Dr. Andrew Bailey is the Senior Manager for Innovation at the Research Contracts and Innovation Department at University of Cape Town. He's also the President-elect for SARIMA. So today's session is going to deal with agreements that you would typically find within the tech transfer space, like the NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, material transfer agreements, institutional agreements, licensing agreements. And Andrew will take us through some of the important provisions to take note of and that we should be aware of, and the typical types of things that we encounter as problems with those type of agreements. And then we will end off the session with dealing with different types of conflict of interest that arise in tech transfer and how to manage such. So over to you, Andrew. We've lost Andrew.
He's still connected for some reason.
Yeah, he's just.
There he is.
There we go. Connected via a different platform.
There we go.
I somehow got disconnected at the critical moment, so I'm back.
Okay.
Good. Great. Sorry, I assume you've introduced me, Janine, and I can go ahead and share my screen.
Yes.
Go ahead. Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry, I just... Great, super. Well, hopefully that'll be the end of the technical problems. It's good to be with you again this morning. And as we did yesterday, I'll pause at the various section dividers and we can pick up on the various questions. So I'll start off by discussing contracts and agreements. And some of the ones that I'm going to touch on today are non-disclosure agreement, research contracts and collaboration agreements, a materials transfer agreement, inter-institutional agreements, and then various forms and sort of effectively things like power of attorneys and confirmation of assignment type of agreements that are required by patent offices. So other sort of documents that are pretty routine in a technology transfer environment. And then I'll spend some time on an actual license agreement. So one of the important things, I think, in managing agreements efficiently within your institution is to have some delegation of authority to conclude specific agreements. And I know we have a framework at the University of Cape Town where we will have a schedule that is based on type of agreement and also the value. as to who may sign those particular agreements off. There's certain levels of agreement where deans can actually sign it off, but otherwise it has to come through the legal team. And then when the values are particularly high, then it goes up to the Deputy Vice Chancellor or the Vice Chancellor to sign. And the reason for doing that is often with those very large projects, you're committing the university's resources, and one needs to be sure that the facilities are able to cope with the specific projects, and this is why the sort of checks and balances are in place. So it also, I've come across some institutions where literally a vice chancellor would need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and non-disclosure agreements, especially in the tech transfer environment, are frequently entered into as you're trying to commercialize technologies. It could also come in when you're trying to negotiate collaborative research, and you need to be able to execute them quickly. So that's definitely the type of agreement that it would be great to have the director of the Technology Transfer Office being able to sign off at least. One needs to think about the retention of copies, and often, the agreements can run for a particular term, so one would like to have them on hand for that period. We keep some sort of within the office in a filing compactum, but after a certain number of years, we then send them off to sort of deep storage, and we would only then sort of, request it on a rare occasion. We typically have a scanned copy that's more readily available on our contracts management system. And then what we do is mark the boxes so that they can be sort of shredded and destroyed at the end of the term of the agreement. And it's good for your institution to have a specific policy. Often, some years back, we found that agreements were being entered into with no specific term, duration of the agreement, which means they go on, in perpetuity. And obviously that is incredibly difficult for someone to manage that, back in 1850, the two institutions had a non-disclosure agreement or whatever, and it's actually still valid and in force. It's better to have a sort of more reasonable term to it. It's good to have a database to manage your contracts. I think initially one can certainly set up something within Access, Microsoft Access, very easily, just to have the ability to quickly determine what contracts you have with a particular partner and or a funder, because often that will be of interest to the university in terms of further work or strengthening a particular collaboration, or knowing how much funding you're getting from a particular funder and has that changed over the years. Some of these databases do have a workflow within them, and there are a variety of systems that are available for one to use. Okay, so let's just touch on a couple of sort of problems that can arise. And the one thing is, and we'll discuss the material transfer agreement, which is really where you're transferring particular materials. They could be things like blood samples or microorganisms going to another party. And it's very specific to managing that transfer and use of the materials. But what we've really found has been problematic is when you begin to sort of bring in little aspects of a research agreement, because you then find that you haven't provided for all aspects that should be in a research agreement. And then if there's a misunderstanding or conflict, you really are in a serious situation because there's no provision for it. So far better to have a separate materials transfer agreement and a research agreement that's associated with it. Beware of commitments to other parties. And I'll touch on that in a further case study where we had consortium research going on and a potential licensee. Beware of other sort of bodies that are set up within agreements. Often a steering committee of a consortium can be tasked with making decisions about patenting and IP protection and commercialization. And a lot of those decisions should actually be coming back to the tech transfer office to consider, or someone else within the university. Often it's not the key interest of the academics who will be the principal investigators and involved and sitting typically on that steering committee. The other thing that I'll touch on in a later case study is where you land up with contracts that have terminated, they've come to an end, and yet the steering committee is still the body that you need to seek approval for or from years after a project has ended, if you want to exploit the intellectual property. So that can be sort of very difficult if you don't make a specific provision for what happens when an agreement actually comes to an end. And the other little warning is beware of what you don't own. So especially with material transfer agreements, it comes up, be very sure that your institution actually owns the materials and that it's not in fact a material that has come into the university that you are now licensing out. And actually in terms of the original materials transfer agreement, there may not be permission for you to do that. Okay, I mentioned this in our other presentation, the IP Handbook of Best Practices. This I find is a fantastic resource. It's online, www, you can see the URL at the top. And they've got a whole stack, you can see just in the background picture here, of sample agreements, and they're from top institutions across the globe. And I think that it's incredibly useful, because if you draw up your own template agreements, what I like to do is to review other people's agreement templates and really pick the best aspects of them for our use. And often it just triggers your thoughts, oh gosh, that's a particular aspect that I hadn't thought of dealing with. So it's a really useful resource, and it also has, you can see here, a lot of case studies. There are the topics where it'll, discuss things like what we were discussing last session, establishing a TTO, but it's got resources, global learning, so it'll point you towards specific learning. There's the online sort of free videos and that sort of a thing that will also point you towards. So really a very useful handbook to have. Great. So as we go into a deeper discussion of the agreements, I just want us to be familiar with the concepts of foreground and background IP. So you can see from my little picture here, this is obviously looking through a car's windscreen at a road going forward. And that's what I think of as the foreground IP. And then the rear view mirror, which is looking back at where you've come from. And that's what I think of as the background IP, what you've built up at the point that you start a particular project. Interestingly though, with background IP, it can sometimes also be intellectual property that's been developed in parallel along the same sort of timeline as the separate project, but it's coming from a different project. And you may want to feed that in. So it is not necessarily in the in the past. It could be other IP that's been developed that needs to be brought into the consortium. The other important aspect is that it can be owned by third parties. So it's not necessarily something that the people who are collaborating in the current project own. Okay, they may have specific rights to use it, but you know, if you were to commercialize, you need to remember that there's a third party who owns some of that background IP. Okay, so let's start off with a non-disclosure agreement. And as I said, it's one of the most common agreements, I think. You need to execute it quickly. As I mentioned, it's great for discussing proposals as you're moving forward collaboratively to apply for funding from a particular funder. Often with industry partners, they will be very keen to enter into some type of non-disclosure agreement so that they can reveal particular problems that the business is facing, that the researchers can then sort of understand, okay, right, this is the type of research that we need to do to address those problems. And they obviously sometimes feel quite vulnerable revealing that information, you know, where things are not going well in a particular business. The provisions can restrict it to specific people within the institution. So, you know, that the information will only be shared with person A and B, or person A and their research group, so that it's really sort of quite tightly ring-fenced. We've done some research where we've looked at financial institutions' investor data to do a study on sort of gender and investment strategy. Now, obviously, I think the general customers of the financial institution would be horrified, you know, to know that data is being used for research or whatever, but under very controlled and, you know, the anonymized conditions, it can actually be released. And we've successfully done that with a number of institutions. And there it was incredibly tightly controlled how data would be stored, how it would be transferred, and that sort of a thing. We typically have a time limit of 5 years. Sometimes if you know it's going to be a long-term relationship, you can say 5 years after each disclosure, and then it would terminate. So it means that in year 5, if I disclose something new, the agreement would run for another 5 years. Where there's a trade secret involved, it may be longer or indefinite. This is one of those cases where it could be indefinite. But as I mentioned, for contract management, it's preferable to have a definite term. Confidential information is typically defined. You need to come up with a scope for the non-disclosure agreement. And you know, one of the things that you've got to be careful of is ensuring that you don't make it too tight a definition, because sometimes during the discussions, it'll spark other ideas, or it may require slightly broader sharing of information. So don't make it absolutely sort of rigid, but ideally define a specific sort of field that one can understand, okay, it's information in this area that is being shared. And normally what you would do is to mark the information that is being shared as confidential. So an email, you just put confidential on it. If there's specific documents, you have it on the footer or whatever, so that the parties readily know that it is confidential. If you happen to share information orally, it's good practice to just send, you know, it could be your meeting minutes, it could be just an email afterwards to say, you know, today we discussed our reactor conditions, and just a reminder that we consider those to be confidential, so that the parties again have a record and understanding of what is actually regarded as confidential. Okay, I don't know if there are any questions at this point.
There was one question on the chat, Andrew. Can the TTO sign research contracts or only agreements like memorandums of understanding or MOAs, memorandums of agreement, I guess?
Yeah, Okay, so that'll all depend on your delegation of authority. So within our tech transfer office at UCT, we have a team of so-called contracts managers who are in fact lawyers who can review and sign off those research agreements. So basically anything other than forming a spin-off company and the university taking equity in that company, anything related to sort of research contracts or licenses and intellectual property transactions can actually be executed by the tech transfer office. But remember, in certain instances, the lawyers will review a particular contract, but if it's worth a certain amount of money, it then needs to go for higher approval, just again to check on resources and risk, obviously, to the university undertaking such a large project. Great. Let's now chat about IP and rights in research contracts and collaboration agreements. So basically, you know, researchers will think of some sort of brilliant idea and consider doing some research to better understand that particular research space. And what happens is that you land up going and getting some funder that will contribute money to support the research activity. And often one is drawing on prior research activity. So that's why I've just shown a little filing cabinet. So it's all of the sort of early stage research that's perhaps been done in that particular subject area. And then you've got the new intellectual property that's being created during that specific research project. And this is what's going to generate your foreground or project intellectual property, okay? And interestingly, the funder, if you think of it, a funder could be a commercial company. They may well want particular access and rights to that foreground or project intellectual property that is coming out. But people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so philanthropic funders, can still have an impact on that foreground and project IP because they will have their global access provisions, which means that when you commercialize the intellectual property, you need to ensure that it is made available to sort of lower income countries on preferential rates and to ensure that those countries also benefit from the outcomes of the research. But, you know, in terms of the background, intellectual property, one needs to think about, you know, where that has come from, the ownership of that background IP. Is it linked to other funders, other corporates? And one needs to, you know, just understand the basis on which background intellectual property can actually be made available for the research project. Typically, it's not a problem when research is being conducted for the research sake. It is more a problem when you take the research outputs out to commercialize, that these sort of considerations become very important. A lot of countries will have specific provisions within their patent acts that allow for free research use. So we don't really worry about infringing patents when we're doing research. Notably in South Africa, that is absent. So, you know, we rely on the fact that the research activity itself is not generating an income per se from a product. So there would be no damage done to an owner of a patent because you're not competing commercially with them during the research phase. Okay, your commercial partner, there can be an agreement then with a commercial partner where the commercial partner is not the same person as the funder. Now, all of this gets even more complex when you've got a multitude of collaborators, all with their own inputs and their own background intellectual property. The funder itself may also have intellectual property and be participating in the project. It can happen, often with science councils. They have specific money that they're allocating and it's going into the project. And that's where these collaboration agreements become really important, that everybody is on the same page. Remember too, that you are bringing materials in to use in the project and that these may not be owned by the consortium members. They could be owned by a third party. And again, when you consider this commercial partner, you've got to be sure that the materials, if they need those materials to produce the products, then that they have access to them for the commercial purposes. One also can have people appointed as subcontractors. Often that is done so that one can retain the ownership of the intellectual property. So you will, within a subcontract agreement, say, I want you to do some very specific work. We're going to pay you, and in the South African environment, it would be at full cost, so that we can own the intellectual property arising from it. But again, you've got this relationship with subcontractors, and agreements may need to be put in place with them. Okay, so from those different scenarios that I went through, we've got a funding agreement, a consortium agreement, materials transfer agreement, subcontracts, and then licenses to foreground and background intellectual property. So all of that can arise from a single research project. So just some considerations when one looks at a consortium agreement. It's good to have confidentiality provisions so that the researchers can collaborate freely with each other, share information, but you are not destroying any potential patent opportunity. One needs to deal with IP ownership. And just from a South African perspective, there's an IPR Act which can govern joint ownership and specific conditions. Check your own legislation for any specific requirements, because these types of national acts are becoming increasingly popular right through sort of India, parts of Europe, and the US, where it probably started with the Bayh-Dole Act. Benefit share. So what one can be talking about there is that you would share in the benefit from the successful commercialization, maybe equally as consortium partners, no matter who owns the intellectual property. So you would keep the intellectual property together as a unit, commercialize it, and then share, because all of the members of the consortium have worked together on the project, so they should derive a benefit. However, it may be agreed that only the people who have generated the intellectual property should benefit, but all of that is negotiated and included in the agreement. You have your steering committee, and here I've stressed again interaction with the TTO when it comes to patenting and support for commercialization strategies. It's typically not the domain of academic researchers, and that's where one needs to make provision for some support. Access to that background intellectual property, and then coordination of that commercialization strategy. So if we have a look at this case study, so the scenario, We've got a research group that's built up 3 different patent families during the course of years of research. Different IP has arisen at different times and from different funded projects. A commercial partner is negotiating a license for the commercial use of those 3 patents. Okay, so what we found was really worthwhile was to actually draw up a table indicating when the IP arose, which of the 3 patent families arose when, and what funding had gone into creating it. Then one could go back to the particular research contract and see well, obviously from your patent records, you'd know which parties own the IP, but importantly, from the original collaboration agreement, you would determine who will share in the benefits, okay? And be careful because sometimes agreements can include benefit share to organizations who don't own the IP. So it could be those consortium partners who are don't have inventors on a patent, but it can also be funders. Sometimes a funder wants a 5% return or whatever if there's a successful commercialization. And this is something that I touched on earlier, where you need to, as we found, we were required to get permission from steering committees that no longer existed. And in fact, some of the parties to the agreement, the specific organizations didn't exist either. So, that can be problematic and make the IP due diligence a lot more difficult unless you've made provisions for that, in your original agreement. Okay, I then just want to go into another scenario where we look at a background intellectual property commitment. So here, a consortium is working on a new vaccine, and at the start of the 5-year project, we know that it may lead to a commercial vaccine. And background IP from a previous project is required for the production of the vaccine if the current research proves successful. So 2 years before the end of the project, the background IP is published and a commercial partner is interested in licensing the patent exclusively. So this is that background IP patent. Now, the problem is that you cannot just give the rights to this new commercial partner that's interested, because you cannot, you've made a commitment to make the background intellectual property available to the consortium. And so your option there is that you could make the background intellectual property available on a non-exclusive basis. And what we actually managed to do was to make it available on what we called a co-exclusive agreement, i.e. we wouldn't license it to any other parties other than the consortium and the commercial partner. And what we did was made provision for the situation if the current research project didn't lead to a vaccine and a commercialization opportunity, that then the consortium would no longer have a right to the background intellectual property, and it could then be licensed exclusively to the commercial party. Interestingly though, the impact of that sort of issue was that it reduced the value of the IP and the return that we received from the commercial license by half. But just very important to look at these sort of situations where, you've made commitments to background IP, and then the other avenues for commercialization. So again, maybe it's a case of, ensuring that it's also clearly stated that it's a non-exclusive right, unless you know that it warrants an exclusive right. Okay, another scenario that I want to chat through is where you've developed an intellectual property platform. So here, a professor's developed a technology that is used to recover metal from their ore, and the university have patented it. So there are numerous mining applications, and the research is very active and doing sort of research for a variety of companies. And in the mining industry, they're very competitive, and each company wants to own the IP coming from the research that they fund. Okay, so starts off, company 1 is mining manganese, company 2 is mining coal. So it's sort of, okay, it's mining, but very different industries. So, it's not really a problem. We could not have given them exclusive rights to the core IP platform technology, but what we could do is license it for application in coal and in metal recovery. So that would keep these two companies happy and allow us to license to both of them. Okay, then along comes company 3, and they're mining zinc. Now you've got a problem that, manganese and zinc are both metals. They're both base metals in case you tried to, ring fence it by saying, okay, you've got rights to base metals. You've just got to be very, very careful about how specific you're going to need to be. And, it's a funny thing, but again, I found that diagrams were very useful to ensure that we understood what the researcher was doing, where the platform technology could go, and how the different sectors would fit together in the mining industry, so that the lawyers could appreciate how to divide up the rights so that you could give, particular rights that were restricted to the operations of the particular mine. So, and this is where you can define them by field, like that specific metal. So you don't say base metal, you say for manganese. Or you could say, right, we're going to divide it by territory. You've got the rights in South Africa. This other company has got the rights in Zambia. And, in that way, you can then license the IP. One of the things that we found was very difficult was when we've got several lawyers who work in that team. And if you looked at each individual agreement with a different mining house and funder, it looked 100%, no problem at all. But when you compared the rights that were being given, say in several different agreements, then you realized you actually, had problems arising because you're sort of promising too much to the one party and it overlaps with what you've promised another party. So in that instance, I think that it's very important to consider if you've identified a specific platform technology, to get one lawyer to handle all of the research collaboration, research work, and also the intellectual property licensing associated with that technology, or at least have this common drawing or diagram which shows which rights have been granted to which parties. Okay, so I'll pause here to check if there are any questions before we go on to discuss interinstitutional agreements.
I don't think that we received any on the chat, Andrew.
Okay, no problem.
And I don't think that anybody's raised their hand, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, great. Good, then on to interinstitutional agreements. Now, these are generally entered into where you have jointly owned intellectual property. So it's often sort of will be two or more universities, and they will be determining how they are going to manage the jointly owned intellectual property. So who will be the commercial lead? Because obviously you want to avoid a situation where you know, both parties are rushing into the market and suddenly, you know, you've approached the same company and they're speaking to University A and University B, and they can effectively then sort of fight, you know, put you up against each other, and you're fighting against each other for the deal. So it's to try and get some sort of coordinated approach. We've often shared it in terms of territory, so that, you know, maybe a particular university will look after Europe, we will look after Africa and maybe the USA, but you will discuss the common strategy. You know, one also needs, and it need not be the same person, to appoint somebody who's going to be the primary person to instruct the patent attorney, so that that party knows that they have the obligation to give that final instruction, or to go to the consortium and gather sort of feedback from the inventors and channel that through to the patent attorneys. And the patent attorneys then know who they need to get the instruction from. One can also look at cost recovery. So patent expenses, normally you would be sharing your patent expenses as you go along, but sometimes one of the parties will have taken on more of the expenses. If there's specific marketing activities, we make provision that pre-approved marketing budgets and expenses, they may be borne by a particular institution at the time, but we will say that, okay, that money can be claimed back from any proceeds from commercialization later on. Sometimes also, if it's the commercialization lead, they can charge an administration fee. Typically, within TTOs, one is not claiming for the labor of the actual TTO staff. Within this, it's sort of given that they would be involved, and generally the marketing activities would be, say, a particular trip to a company to market the technology or something like that. What you've also got to deal with is what are the consequences of a party withdrawing? So, you know, budgets can change, interests can change, you know, and for that reason, whilst initially everybody is sharing patent expenses, sometimes you find that, okay, the one party can no longer afford to, or it's a situation where, you know, I think that it's a brilliant idea to file a patent in Japan, but the other party thinks, no ways, you know, you're never going to get successful commercialization in Japan. And so they don't want to support that. So you manage how the benefit will accrue from that territory. So maybe because I'm paying for the patent rights in Japan, then if there is successful commercialization in Japan, I should be the party, the only party to get the benefit from that particular territory. What I also try and get to, although it can be very difficult, is to come up with minimum licensing agreement requirements. So, you know, in an annexure, you say, okay, these are the key clauses that have got to be included in a license agreement. And you may have particular national requirements. You also may want to say, you know, as we always do as a university, we want to retain the right to use the intellectual property for further research and teaching purposes. And you want to be sure that that flows through into the license agreement. If I've just got a little URL here. This is a model interinstitutional agreement. Very useful resource. Looking at these, it goes into it in a great deal more detail and was put together as, in fact, a consortium project. So very useful. Okay, I've mentioned the various sort of things that you're looking at. One always also wants to include warranties or disclaimers so that you're protected, especially in the medical space, from a commercial partner's use of the technology. And you may want to sort of ensure that you've got the right to sub-license. But these are the various things and compliance with local legislation that you may need to put into those minimum terms. In terms of South African legislation, and this is just for the South African participants, we need in certain instances to approach the National IP Management Office, and that can be something that impacts commercialization when especially when we've got a foreign partner, a non-South African partner, and also a non-South African commercial partner that we're licensing to. And there's also exchange control issues because intellectual property is regarded as capital, so moving it out of the country requires specific permissions. But you can find out a lot more you know, in other resources on that. Sometimes what I've tried to do is to also bring in minimum royalties or an understanding of what type of deal structure you may have. Because what you find is that that lead commercial partner is wanting the freedom to negotiate the deal without having to come back to you every time to say, do you agree with this? Okay, back to the commercial partner. You need to give them a mandate. And this, I think, provides a good framework. So it's the minimum requirements. Okay, you must get a royalty of 3%, you know, i.e. if you're negotiating and you've started at 5 and you're getting down to 4%, that's fine. It's above our minimum requirement. Go, you know, go ahead. You don't need to check back with us. For the South Africans, it also tends to set a bit of a framework for the necessary approvals that you may be needing to get. So just a couple of case studies related to that. The first one, L, is a US university. So we were the commercialization lead, but they wouldn't agree to their portion of the IP being controlled by South African legislation. So, you know, they didn't understand our specific IPR Act, and it was really sort of problematic. The solution was that we say that, okay, only the UCT portion is subject to the SA law, but effectively you've still got to go through those approvals in any case. So it's really a win-win situation, and they don't feel sort of bound by the South African law that they don't understand. The issue was, in the US, the parties can act independently. And it's a really unusual situation, but joint owners of a patent can actually do sort of what they want with the patent, independent of one another. They don't need to seek permissions. And this is another important thing, that within an IIA, you can then get an understanding that people won't go off and act independently. Okay, the next scenario case study is a USA research hospital. So we were the commercial lead. They didn't want to pursue the intellectual property, but they wouldn't enter into an interinstitutional agreement. The issue was that they couldn't, they had federal funding, so they couldn't assign the intellectual property to their inventor or to UCT because of the US Bayh-Dole Act, which says that if federal money is used, the IP is owned by the institution and it may not be assigned. It can be licensed, but it may never change ownership. Okay, for us, it meant that we were paying the full cost, but there was a deemed ownership of 50%. So our government rebate was lower. And then we landed up with another sort of curved ball where within our programs, there was a common funder and it was a commercial partner. And we had signed an agreement which did not give sort of royalty-free rights to that commercial partner from the research that was arising, because it's not compliant with our local legislation. However, the research hospital had that clause in their agreement and effectively granted the common funder that non-exclusive royalty-free license for the IP. And being in the US, and we hadn't entered into an interinstitutional agreement, they were able to proceed as they wished. Okay, so just some sort of scenarios for you to think through. Again, any questions at this point?
We did get two questions, Andrew. The first one is, what is the best way to decide on royalties for IIAs?
Okay, so, you know, I think that what one needs to do is to do your research on the typical royalty ranges in a particular sector. Sometimes also one can say that you're going to leave it till later on, once the technology is developed and you better understand its value or the potential product's value. So you say that ahead of actual commercial activity, where you start doing that licensing, we will agree on the minimum royalty term. So you may not be able to define it absolutely, you know, at the outset where you've just signed the agreement because you've filed the priority patent application. It may come down the line, but generally you would do research to find out what the range would be and then set a mutually agreed lower limit.
Thank you for that. And there was another question from Damien. Could royalties be altered or renegotiated over the years as commercialization progresses?
You know, it can. License agreements don't have to run till the patents expire. You can have them running for, you know, a certain number of years, and then you can renegotiate the terms with the licensee. I've also seen sort of things where there's sort of a structure where the royalty decreases as particular levels of sales or return have been derived. So maybe sort of once the sales exceed $1 million, you drop from, you know, 3% to 2%. So it's like on a bit of a sliding scale, so that you get your benefit up front. And, you know, I think that a lot of that can also sort of fit in with the various milestone payments.
Thank you very much. Those were the two questions that we received
Great.
on interinstitutional agreements, Andrew.
Good, super. So let's move on to material transfer agreements. And, you know, generally within the research community, materials are shared for free. And it's again, very frequent, especially in the biotechnology space. But certain materials can have commercial value. Ultimately, if people start making products based on the technology. And the other important aspect in the biotech space is that biodiversity legislation has come into play. And you can read more about the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that applies to a lot of signatory countries. And one needs to sort of I guess, safeguard and look after local genetic resources and biological resources within your country. So MTAs just generally specify the terms of the transfer of materials between two or more parties. Interestingly, it's a transfer in terms of possession, not the title. The party providing the material retains full ownership of it, and the receiving party holds the materials in trust. And sometimes it can include transferring both tangible sort of biological materials as well as certain intellectual property rights by means of a license. So it's that situation, you know, in the consortium agreement where the materials are used by the consortium, but actually the process may also be covered by an intellectual property right. You may have patented a particular genetically modified organism that is being transferred to another party. I've just listed some of the biological materials that you typically find, but there can also be other materials. So, for example, trial catalysts for chemical processes, polymers. This is especially so in the medical device arena, where they're wanting to control use to ensure safety of patients and understand how it's being used. And also in certain instances, that MTA will include restrictions to prevent the third parties or recipients of that material from filing patents without their permission that could effectively block use in specific markets through that patenting activity. What we've developed is a glossary for lawyers, and you know, the lawyers struggle with the different biological concepts or whatever, and we've also done some training where we've, you know, very simply explained how all of these different biological materials fit together. It's very useful for them to get a sense of these, you know, synonyms as well as, you know, the different components, because they can then, it gives them context for a legal agreement. You know, and as I said in my previous presentation, Wikipedia is a very close friend to look up, you know, what is this term and, you know, what does it mean? Although there is free use by the institutions, one can allow for the cost of manufacture. Sometimes, you know, you've got to get the culture out of the freezer, you've got to grow it up, you've then got to, you know, get it into a form that it can be transported. And then the actual transport costs, you know, especially if it's got to be frozen during transport across continents, can be particularly expensive. So sometimes, you know, whilst you're providing it for free, you can make allowance for cost of manufacture or transport costs. When it relates to commercial use, you can provide for an option period, okay, so where they can test it out to see if it actually works. And you can potentially link the material's use to specific products or processes only. And then again, it can sort of link into royalties or once-off payments. And the IP handbook has got some indications of royalties. So you can have a look at that, and I've included a specific link there that has an example. MTAs generally impose restrictions on the use, and you need to fully understand what the researchers are planning to do. And, you know, this is where the material may be released to only a particular person's research group, and it may not be moved even within the university to another research group. So you need to understand from the researcher, you know, how are they going to be using it? Are they going to be collaborating with others within the university? And, you know, or even within their department, you know, even if it's not another sort of faculty or something. So we find that to try and sort of gather this information, we've got a little questionnaire, which we call as a materials disclosure form. And we've got different ones for materials that are coming into the university and others for the materials going out. And what one's trying to gather from that is how long are you going to use it for? What is the type of the project? Is the material going to be restricted to that specific project? Because often you find that the, you know, the researchers would love to give it a try on a different project or whatever, to understand whether they're going to be specific derivatives of the material. So with the biological material, you may have received a particular gene, you've put it into a genetically modified organism, that then is effectively a derivative of the material. Does one need access for potential commercial application down the line? Because some providers of materials will say it may not be used for commercial use at all. Or one needs to understand when you need to go back to them to assess that. Who's funding the project? And then for a South African situation, whether there are any triggers relating to the IPR Act or exchange control. Okay, with the outbound materials, you're looking at the funder again. So this is where you're trying to pick up, is it a commercial partner that's involved? Where did the material come from? Who created it? And we try and get reference numbers so that, you know, when the researchers come back to us a few months later and they want another MTA, we can actually use similar reference numbers and we know we're talking about the same material. And normally their culture collections or whatever will have unique reference numbers, but I find it very difficult if you say, okay, well, it was some, you know, mammalian cells. Well, which cells, where did they come from? Are these cells the same as, you know, the other ones that were transported? So it's great if you can have a specific reference so that you can control it. And then something to keep an eye on is whether third-party material is incorporated. And that's where you've really got to ask the researchers, you know, in your genetically modified organism or plasmid, have you used a third party's material and is it in this? Because often they've forgotten about it and one needs to almost sort of go through, you know, in detail where it is, but it will prompt them and hopefully remind them to look at that. You need to understand, does the Biodiversity Act apply? So it's the Nagoya protocol, which also sort of flows into bioprospecting and bioprospecting use. And, you know, whilst one is entering into a, you know, an MTA, there may be other permits that are required. So you could have these bioprospecting permits, or where you're moving human tissue samples or organs, blood. You may need Department of Health permits, and certainly Department of Agriculture, where you're looking at moving animals or plant materials particularly, and quarantine arrangements, excuse me, that may need to be associated with, you know, the different materials that are being transferred. So animals can be regarded as materials. Sometimes one has very specific laboratory mice that are bred that have specific characteristics, and they would be governed by a materials transfer agreement as well. Okay, it's good to check in terms of compliance that, you know, you've got your MTAs, that researchers are disposing of material at the end of the material transfer agreement, because it'll say you can have the material for 5 years and then it must either be destroyed or returned. Typically, the person that's provided the materials will say whether it should be destroyed or returned at the end of the period. And then watch for this distribution within the institution, that it's people know that it may not be moved. The range of definitions, I'm not going to go into them now, but you know, it's important to understand you've got your original material, and then you've got all of these sort of modifications or progeny. So it's an unmodified descendant, unmodified derivatives, and all of these have got specific you know, examples within the biotech space. And it's important that you look at all of these different aspects within your MTA, because sometimes the ownership, the way that those different things would be owned would be different in different circumstances. There's a uniform biological MTA. And it's something that you can have a look at. It was published by the National Institutes of Health in the USA. And for the South Africans, it doesn't contravene the requirements of the IPR Act. It just needs to be adjusted that the joint ownership meets the requirements of Clause 15. So that's a very well understood and standard type of agreement. That you may like to reference. Otherwise, have a look at the IP Management Handbook. Okay, I don't know if there are any questions at this point.
Yes, so we received 2 questions. One question is on whether indigenous knowledge systems or African traditional medicines fall under MTAs, or can be considered a material.
You know, the medicines themselves could well be. Obviously, you're not looking at the sort of retail situation, but certainly within those Bioprospecting Act requirements, there may be medicinal use of plants, which would require specific permitting. And there are, in fact, material transfer agreements between people who are providing the actual indigenous material. So, you know, you may have a Sangoma who has knowledge, traditional knowledge, that a particular plant is useful for a certain treatment or condition. They are then involved with research, and researchers are trying to find out what the active ingredient is. Then there would be a material transfer agreement relating to the provision of that plant material. The knowledge would also need to be you know, respected, and that's typically where it links in with benefit share arrangements. Often with traditional knowledge, you're not necessarily dealing with patents, because it's knowledge that's been around for a long time. But sometimes patents do arise because you've found what that active ingredient is, the actual molecule, and now you're able to produce it synthetically or whatever. And you know, an example of that is like the willow tree with salicylic acid and aspirin. So there was originally a patent for that, and that you know, was something that was, you know, I think people used to sort of chew bark or whatever, and realized that it relieved pain, and then it sort of got refined.
Thank you, Andrew. And the second question was whether MTAs include the data generated on the materials covered.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Data, we're actually now beginning to develop increasingly data transfer agreements where, you know, in this age of big data and these large data sets, where you are providing access to different individuals relating to these data sets. So data can certainly be managed within like a material transfer agreement, very, very similar. And that's is a good point. And I didn't actually include anything on that. But certainly it's something that's coming to a fore. And there you're looking at sometimes where it's health related data, you're needing to ensure that you understand the use by the third party to ensure that it fits in with the original patient consent. And again, there's ownership there. You know, it can include terms relating to the mention in publications, co-authoring, acknowledgements, attribution. So all of those aspects would certainly come into it.
And this is more a question of mine, Andrew, not necessarily directly related to MTAs, but where and how exactly do you deal with potential ethical aspects of the research? Under which one of these instruments that you're mentioning, how do you make sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to the ethical implications of research?
Okay, so what is interesting is, so we would have separate ethics committees. And again, there is legislation, as I'm sure there probably is in you know, many countries, that govern the constitution of research ethics committees, and especially human research ethics committees. And certainly I know for a lot of the export sort of permits, or where there are materials going out, the Department of Health in South Africa is actually wanting the ethics committee to have reviewed the use of the material so that it does fit in with the consents and that sort of a thing. So there's sort of almost an approval by the ethics committee, and then your materials transfer agreement signed by the university. So that's sort of where it's coming together. But you know, it is a very important aspect, and you know, one where I think one is needing, especially with human samples and data and that. Yeah, you're needing to be a lot more careful from that sort of ethics perspective and what's being used. You know, typically your research projects would be approved by an ethics committee, and the materials that were then coming into the university would then be part of that review. So for inbound materials, they would be reviewed within that particular space. So here, your home university would be checking to ensure that there were the necessary consents for that inbound material to be used in the research. Okay, so just a very short thing on the patent office agreements. So there are a number of them, and there's the confirmation of assignment. So this is assignment of the intellectual property from the inventors to the institution. Sometimes confirmation that they are actually inventors. These are signed by the inventors themselves. There's a declaration on disclosure of information. This is required particularly in the US, where you're saying, to the best of your knowledge, there's no other sort of prior art that relates to the patent application that you're making. You've provided them with all the relevant documentation. And then there's the power of attorney. And this is where the institution will be appointing both local and foreign attorneys to manage the patent prosecution. And this is, again, another document that it's great if the director of the TTO can sign off, rather than because they tend to be pretty standard. There are lots of them, and it's preferable, you know, so that they're not having to go, you know, up and really use, you know, very senior people's time when it's a pretty standard arrangement. And often that delegated authority can be specific, that you may enter into powers of attorney for patent prosecution purposes only, which then limits that right. Interestingly, in South Africa, we have a particular form on the South African patents, which is a declaration as to whether or not it relates to indigenous knowledge or biodiversity. And that, again, is a mechanism to highlight where you know, the bioprospecting or traditional knowledge acts are coming into play. Sorry. Okay, on to license agreements then. So a license agreement provides access to a party for a particular period of time, and it can be a fixed period or sometimes the life of a patent. It can be exclusive or non-exclusive. So, you know, if you're licensing it to a single company, you can typically get a higher price for it. If it's non-exclusive, if you think of Microsoft and how they license their software, it's on a non-exclusive basis. You can look at a far wider reach and more revenue coming in. It can be exclusive, but restricted by field. So here I've sort of indicated that, okay, maybe you've got it specifically licensed for modems versus, you know, larger, you know, transmission systems, or, you know, electric vehicles versus an electric helicopter. You can also restrict it by territory. So I could give somebody rights to use the patent, and I'm just, you know, I don't know where this graph sort of came from, but, you know, I could give one person the rights for all the sort of one shade of blue areas, and then other people rights for the other shades. So you can say that for these countries, you know, company A has rights, for the other countries, company B, etc., so that you can ring fence it in that way. So it defines the terms of use. It could be free. You would look at either an upfront payment, so when you sign that they would pay a certain amount of money, or maybe a milestone payment. And often these are linked to getting through a particular phase of a clinical trial, or maybe if a patent is granted in, you know, an examining territory like Europe or the US, you know, you then, the IP has increased in value, and the licensee may be willing to, you know, make a once-off payment acknowledging that milestone. One has a royalty being a percentage based on the selling price of the product. Be careful not to link it to profit, because profit, your accountants can manipulate profit, certainly for tax purposes, and all sorts of things can be brought in to remove sort of evidence of profit. So rather rely on something such as an invoice, where you can, you know, actually audit and understand. You may allow for certain deductions to be made, and that's negotiated and agreed. One should also, and this relates to, you know, that whole patent budget story that I spoke of last time, you should be looking at recovering your historical and ongoing patent expenses. Okay, we've largely touched on that. Warranties and indemnities. So often you will warrant that you have the right to license the intellectual property, i.e. you are the owner, which is something that you can. What one does not warrant is that it will not infringe somebody else's IP. You know, it's very difficult to say that conclusively, and it really is for the commercial partner to look at this whole freedom to operate issue. So I would always try and include that. And typically, one also doesn't warrant that it's, you know, going to be marketable for use in their particular product. You know, don't get tied in where they say, oh, well, it's not working, we're going to sue you type of thing. Okay. So yeah, don't get tied down with a certain sort of efficacy or whatever, unless it's something that you specifically can warrant and is part of the deal and that you're being rewarded for that. They're paying you specifically for that. Look at what happens when you terminate the license. It can terminate if the licensee no longer wishes to use the IP, or if they've breached some term, or the agreement has expired. But just understand, and some of those circumstances may perhaps be different. Think of improvements and new IP, those that are made by the licensee. Does the licensee have the right to them? Does the university? Sometimes I've seen that the university claims rights to improvements on their patents. It's interesting. I would imagine it's pretty hard to justify. What about improvements that are made by the research group? You're still doing research and development. You come up with some improvements. Does that licensee immediately have a right to those improvements? So payments, there's a royalty report that you get. They can be quarterly or annually. One includes a right to audit records. And you know, that's really just for governance purposes. And again, patent prosecution, who's paying costs, what are the consequences if people elect not to pay in a particular territory. The right to sub-license, often one can get 25%. It's a pretty standard percentage of what the licensee is getting from their sub-licensee. Sometimes it's better for you to manage all of those license agreements and not allow sub-licensing. What one needs to look at also is that all of the licensee obligations are transferred down to the sub-licensee in those agreements. And one needs to consider what happens if the primary license is terminated. Patent infringement, again, I'm not going to go into that in detail, but it's really just who is going to take action and how the benefits will be shared amongst you. So assignment is transfer of ownership of a patent, and it can sometimes involve a once-off payment, or you can again build in sort of royalties or milestone payments, or it can be in return for shares in a company. Sometimes investors like the university to assign the IP because the IP then becomes an asset of that startup company. And it also forces the institution to share risk, because you will only get benefit if the company is successful, whereas a royalty is basically based on sales. So you will start being paid royalties the moment the sales are being made. Okay, any questions on that before we go into the last section, which is just around managing conflicts of interest?
I think you can go ahead, Andrew, after having a little drink of water. We haven't received any questions on the chat, so I'd probably save it for the Q&A session.
Great. Good. Okay. So on then to managing conflicts of interest. This is where we start with a poll, and it's, does your institution have a conflict of interest or a private work policy? So if you can vote on that please. So the options are yes, no, or I'm not sure, which can often be the case. I know our conflict of interest policy is so well hidden that I think nobody really knows where it is. Great. Okay, so the bulk do have conflict of interest policies. Some don't, and yeah, as I know, a lot of people in our institution wouldn't be fully aware of where exactly our policy was. Great. So let's think about where conflicts of interest can arise, and they can arise during procurement of services, as I'm sure that you can understand, product endorsement versus a source of or a source of funding. You know, often, especially in the in a number of journals, people are interested to know your relationship with a particular product manufacturer. Say you've assessed a particular product and how it works. Were you funded by that manufacturer? You know, how objective were you? Consulting, side companies that researchers and academics and general staff at the university happen to be running. And then also between the postgraduate student and the supervisor, potentially. So to me, some of the key tools in managing conflict of interest, first of all, would be your intellectual property policy. If you have a private work policy, conflict of interest policy, and within that, a framework for declaration of personal interests on a typically annual basis, and then procurement or finance policies, so that everybody knows what the rules are, and where conflict is noted, because there will be conflicts that are noted, that there is transparency, adherence to procedure, and arm's length management sort of overview or control of the situation. And that really will ensure that that hopefully these conflicts are understood and managed. So if we start off on the IP policy, one needs to think of who's creating the intellectual property. Here, you know, one needs to think about visitors to your institution, and are they using your resources? What are the terms of their visit? You know, if they're on sabbatical for 6 months. I think the IP policy certainly gives people outside of the institution a clear idea of how things are managed within the university, who owns the intellectual property, and what the policies are. And internally, your staff and various levels of students will also have clarity. In terms of policy development, it's good that you've got representation from every faculty and certain special groupings when you develop it. You know, I think that different faculties certainly see intellectual property from different perspectives. From the TTO, you may be working heavily with science, engineering, health sciences, but one also needs within the IP policy to make provision for arts and humanities, social sciences. Who owns the IP? It can range. It can be governed by country or country legislation. And it could be the university that owns it. It could be a holding company that the university's appointed. or a funder who has commissioned particular research at the university. And with visitors, it could well be their home institution that supersede your IP policy. One needs to watch different employment contracts. Sometimes you have joint appointments, and you've got a whole host of different types of appointment. And these are things that, again, you may have different rules or requirements for different categories of staff. And again, with students, your undergraduate staff, I know that we don't worry about intellectual property that is arising from work that they're doing. If they're doing a piece of software development, we're not going to claim ownership of that. It's part of the teaching process. If they do something that's completely on their own, in their dorm room, where they start a business or create some IP, over to them. With postgraduate students, it's where the IP is related to the research that it's important. But if it's outside of their research project, we may sort of ring fence it so that they would own the full rights to that. With staff, one needs to consider there whether it's within the scope of their professional work, because they're, regardless, it would typically be owned by the university if the university owns the output from research. It will deal with that IP assignment issue, assistance with the patent prosecution process, and yeah, this is just a list of the different sort of factors, and it does draw on all of these different sort of other policies, that need to be in place as well, to support the IP policy. Okay, yeah, that was a bit on the sort of royalty share or whatever. I know that we had a question on rewarding inventors. So, typically the benefit share that comes in, you reward inventors, and then the rest goes into sort of your research groups, the department, faculty, to the university center. It can support TTO functions. And one needs to make provision for academics and students who have left the university. Do they still get their share? And, in our specific circumstances, they do. So I'm just interested, this is our next poll. Does your institution have an IP policy? So it's a simple yes or no. Something that I think has been brilliant, 100%, fantastic. Well, that's good. So yeah, you know what that's all about. What I found sometimes is that, there is an IP policy, but often a lot of people are not that aware of its contents. And, we try the whole time to raise certain issues, elements, or whatever, and deal with aspects in different presentations so that people are aware of the particular policy, and going forward, because yeah, it is often not that people know it's there, but they haven't read it. Okay, and then the other question that I wanted to ask was, who owns the IP at your institution? So your answers or options are the institution, or the academic researcher or student, or another option, it depends on the type of IP. It's interesting, right across the world, there's been a lot of change in Germany, and where the sort of professors used to have a right, then it moved to the institutions. In Japan, it's been similar, where it's moved to the institutions. In Sweden, I know that the professors themselves have the ownership. Okay, interesting. So yeah, 73% to the institution. The, you know, one depends on the type of IP. Would be great if there's time during the discussion at the end to find out how that works. I know in our case, a lot of the sort of copyright in course materials, in publications, you know, journal publications and that, all of that copyright is owned by the author. The university doesn't claim ownership on it. So that's where, yeah, it's I guess, dependent on the type of IP as well. Great. So private work and consulting. So, okay, private work is work done outside, and I've just sort of copied the one from UCT, but where it's unrelated to the professional role of the staff member, and doesn't require any use of the facilities or them employing another UCT staff member who reports to them directly or indirectly. So what they typically give as an example is an engineer by day at the university who is a jazz musician at night. That is no problem. It is private work. It's clearly distinguished from their professional work. Professional work for a third party. So this is where you're bringing in that consulting element. And it can include a person's own company or closed corporation. And where that is related to their professional capacity or the professional qualifications of the staff member. And this is where consulting comes in. Now, consulting should be regarded as a short intervention. And it, you know, one's typically thinking of it being largely advisory, and it shouldn't require extensive use of university resources or generate significant IP. Within our framework, you can work via a UCT contract, which is then prepared by a UCT lawyer, and you're covered by the UCT professional insurance indemnity. And UCT then handles the invoicing, debt collection, and tax. And a TTO can actually coordinate that consulting activity. We don't specifically, but I know a number of institutions do that. Or in our case, we've made provision for staff members to enter into private contracts. They're responsible then for the invoicing. There isn't insurance cover, and they also need to be responsible for any intellectual property arrangements or university authorization for IP that's related. Within a TTO, you can land up with conflicts of interest, and this is where you know, there's often a lot of talk about whether TTO staff should be getting a commission from a particular deal, sharing in the benefit, or participating in spin-off companies for gain. And I think your issues there are that, you know, it can certainly change behavior. It can impact the objectivity of deals. You know, it can lead to disputes about the sharing of work amongst the staff, and also, you know, where the individuals actually pay the most attention in their portfolio. So one needs to be very careful about managing those sort of aspects. Entrepreneur in residence or mentors, you have similar issues to your TTO staff issues. And sometimes you are wanting them to move out with a specific spin-off company, and that's less of an issue. But, you know, in other instances, you know, mentors are typically dissuaded from taking equity in spin-off companies. And one's looking for successful business people who are just wanting to give back. Because again, it can lead to a loss of objectivity and, you know, mentors forcing their way into particular spin-off companies, especially when there are very young sort of graduates involved and getting equity in them. Directors appointed by the university to act on a spin-off company board. So, you know, it depends on the university policy, but we find that so that staff of the TTO are not allowed to be appointed as a UCT appointed director. We'll rather find some other staff member. And this is because if you are needing to resolve an issue with a spin-off company about, you know, a licensing deal or whatever, or how they're utilizing the IP, they're not in a good position in terms of conflict, you know, because you potentially conflicted because you're a director, or and you're having to look after the sort of university's interests as well. With spin-off companies, providing service to a high back to the institution, one needs to obviously watch that prices haven't been inflated. It's very problematic if current students or staff are shareholders. Often if the university also has equity, then you know, you're on both sides of the fence, and it can tend to eliminate a conflict of interest. And in South Africa, the Higher Education Act is very strict in this regard about staff companies providing services to an institution. Contracting research back from a spin-off company, again, keep it at arm's length, get an independent staff member to oversee the work, quotes, financials, and watch the continued flow of information backwards and forwards. Yeah, and then obviously there can be instances where people channel research work out through into their spin-off company rather than doing the work within the university. And that's something you also want to guard against. And I'm sure you can imagine the problems that can create. Often there's a gray area whilst you're creating a spin-off company, as people sort of are moving off into the spin-off and they've still got a foot in the company and a foot in the university. Yeah, so just some issues to be aware of there. And I've, yeah, just listed some points around incubation. I'm just noting the time, and I'm sure that, you know, it's pretty self-explanatory if you're able to go through the slides that you'll be receiving later. One thing with the incubation within university, be sure that the head of department is briefed upfront and has approved everything. And it's not just the head of a research group, because it can cause a lot of upset down the line. Declaration of personal interest. So this would come in with your conflict of interest policy. It should be submitted annually by all staff, but particularly your more senior staff. The interesting thing is that you must have a mechanism for reviewing the submission and noting where the conflicts may arise. And I think, you know, it's often very difficult to get a vision of that across the university. And, you know, when new work is being considered or new deals, to sort of review that. And I think it's an area where, yeah, there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to access that type of information very easily. So these are the sample questions. So it's your own holdings and personal or beneficial interests, your fiduciary and other appointments. So it's just really where you would list, you know, if you're a director on a company or whatever, honorary appointments, that sort of a thing. And then beneficial interests and fiduciary appointments of family members. You know, and this I find sometimes when it goes to siblings or whatever, it really gets fairly complicated because you may not be aware of all of their business dealings. But I think it's just as long as you sort of flag situations that you're aware of could impact various activities that are being conducted by the university. Say a new building is being built and your brother-in-law is, you know, an architect or the owner of the company that's building the new building. So that is the end of my presentation. So I don't know if there are any final questions, and sorry, I realize that there's quite a limited time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. There were a couple questions, given that we are at the end of the presentation. Perhaps the people that have raised those questions or asked those questions can open up their mics and ask them themselves. So I think that there was Ibrahim that had a question regarding the potential use of an MIT invention. So Ibrahim, if you're still there, do you want to go ahead and ask that question?
Yes, hello.
Hi. Hi.
Yes,
Hi.
yes, hi. The question is based on our experience in the university. We had a team of researchers who have been working on the development of an emergency ventilator.
Okay.
Some part of the team are fellows of MIT.
Right.
So when MIT team developed the ventilator, they came up with the design specifications of the mechanism, and they made it an open source for anybody, from anywhere to use and maybe build upon that. This team used the design specifications. They developed the controller, that is their own work. They have developed a prototype.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue there was, I insisted that they should innovate. They should come up with an innovation, a modification to the design produced by MIT.
Okay.
However, they decided to simply go ahead and produce one-to-one of what MIT produced.
Right.
So can they own this IP? Can they patent it and commercialize?
You know, if they are using the MIT design exactly, your problem is that it would no longer be novel.
That's
so
right.
You would not be able to apply for a patent, even in, you know, your country, if the patent didn't exist there. And the fact that MIT have made it available sort of open source, you know, is also, you know, something where you could certainly sell the products. Most likely you would need to check the actual conditions on which the designs were released. Sometimes they're released under Creative Commons.
Yeah.
And with that, there can be restrictions on commercial use. But, you know, sometimes, say, with that design, this is an issue that the Creative Commons team struggle with, because, you know, is commercial use recouping the actual costs of manufacture or not? You know, it's not making a profit, but, you know, so, but I would just check the terms on which MIT made that available. Certainly, you know, if it had been, you know, as you said, you had wanted them to innovate, then there could well have been aspects that were new and inventive and could then potentially have been patented.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. Luan from University of Western Cape had a question as well. Do you want to go ahead and ask that question directly to Andrew?
Hi, sure, no problem. Andrew, my question relates to double dipping, essentially.
Yeah.
So the way that I phrased it is, if a researcher develops IP within their course and scope, within the course and scope of their position at the university, and then wants to license and commercialize the IP in their own capacity through a company of their own, is it best practice to have that particular researcher waive their share of royalties coming into the university?
Yeah, look, it's an typically, you know, the researcher is going to derive the maximum benefit by taking that risk and going off and commercializing the IP. Where sort of from a UCT perspective, where we sort of look at double dipping is, you know, are you still being employed by the university and you've got sort of a bit of equity on the side in a spin-off company, you know, and there are others who are effectively doing a lot of the work in commercializing the product within the company. In that instance, but you own equity in the spin-off company. In that instance, we would say that they are deriving their benefit from the equity that they have in that company and should waive the right to a share in the royalties. If, however, it's a person who has either decreased their work hours or has left the university to go in to that company, or it's a situation where that person is within the sort of framework of what's allowed with academics, where in our instance you can do 20% private work, or sort of consulting work that can be for your own company. If within that 20%, they're actively driving things forward in the company, that's where we would perhaps consider that they could get both the equity as well as any benefit share coming in from revenue that the university gets. So it's very much on whether the person is actually taking a risk and the amount of effort that they're putting into the spin-off company. Also, I think in terms of negotiating the license with the spin-off company, you know, depending on, I guess, the team involved or whatever, one can typically build that sort of into the negotiations, where you may say, okay, we will be slightly softer on the royalty rate that we are going to ask, because we acknowledge you getting your benefit from within the spin-off company. So that's where, you know, you'll derive benefit. The university can then receive somewhat less because you're not going to be getting benefit on the university side of the fence.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andre. I think that Janine actually had one question. I know that Anna from the AEIP did as well. So Janine?
Yes, I just wanted to know who approves the appointment of the university nominated directors on spin-off companies.
Okay, so just talking about it from a UCT perspective, we have an IP advisory committee. So they have a delegated authority from council to assess whether a spin-off company should be created or not, the amount of equity that the university should get, and also to then assess director requirements and review sort of people put forward as potential directors, and select a director. They then make a recommendation for that director to be appointed to the board, which is done by the Vice Chancellor. So the Vice Chancellor would note that the IP Advisory Committee had made such and such a recommendation, and then the person is appointed with a letter of appointment, and it runs from the VC's office. You know, I think that we also try and find people that are a good fit to complement the skills in the spin-off company. One of the things that we've been needing to do is, and ran for the first time last year, was some director training workshops, so that it's creating a pool of potential directors who we know have gone through a level of training. Because, you know, I think historically it would be, oh, well, you know, let's appoint this dean or head of department or whatever, and you find that they may not necessarily have served as a director before. So it's important that they've got that that knowledge, and the people can actually be from outside of the university. You know, it's regarded as a service to the university. So the directors are actually not paid for doing this, you know, for working on the particular spin-off company's board as the university appointed director. And this is something that we've looked at, you know, quite a lot, and have done a few surveys. And the norm appears to be that directors are not paid to participate on boards where a university is appointing them. You'd obviously cover their expenses, you know, if they had to fly down for meetings or whatever.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I was just maybe wondering if you could share a case of a more like gray area. I mean, it's clear you have a lot of tools to organize conflict of interest, but I was wondering maybe a few examples of triggers on how to organize more intangible resources.
You know, I think it's very difficult, because I think that there's probably a stack that goes on that we're not aware of. And, you know, I think one's just got to rely on, well, I guess another tool regarding this would be your whistleblower line. Because in the one instance, we found that, and it actually crops up quite often, where, say, a student supervisor has got a commercial company, and the supervisor designs the research work to effectively answer questions that are useful to the company, or they ask the student to do certain tasks that are of direct benefit to the company, and yet the student is not being paid for that type of thing. That can be really problematic. And, you know, we had quite a sort of nasty situation come to light where, you know, students were sort of quite, what's the right word? Sort of, they were respectful of their supervisors. I think they feared them a little bit. They were quite fearsome people. And they were too scared to talk up. And they landed up having, you know, a situation where they'd been promised payment and sort of bursaries were contingent on them doing certain, providing certain services and that sort of a thing. I think that really was a problem, which was brought to the head of department. So, you rely on that, I guess, more informal network to unearth these sort of issues. Where we know there are spin-off companies, we try and ensure that we have, a clear understanding of how students are involved and how work is flowing in. We've got a situation at present where there's a particular spin-off company, and one of the so it's all staff, but the group leader has various funds that are available as sort of, I guess, surplus or profits from years of research. And now that is being applied to support some of these people, whilst the spin-off company, will ultimately be incorporated and launch. So, what we've said is, okay, but because the team are working on exactly what you're, exactly on what is benefit to the company, we want the head of department to know and approve of this activity, which is something that we've done. And then, to me, it's that transparency which is the important thing. That as long as there's clear understanding, openness, then one can manage these sort of areas. And I think it's through discussion, openness, and trying to get things to work and to be regulated, that one will win. And I think if people across the institution see that you will arrange something to manage a situation, people will be less reluctant to come forward, and they're less likely to sort of hide specific issues that where there's conflict.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think that we can leave it at that and wrap up today's session. I'd like to extend a very warm thanks, first of all, to all of you who have joined us for the past 4 sessions and this workshop. We're very grateful for the time that you have dedicated to following the workshop, and we truly hope that the workshop, the content, each of the presentations have met your expectations, and that you've come out of this with a bit better knowledge and capacities to further pursue your tech transfer activities at home. So thank you very much for having joined us and for your contributions and questions asked during each one of the 4 sessions. Of course, I'd like to thank as well Sarima, and particularly Sumasa and Janine, for having accepted to join up with the AEIP in putting this workshop together. Thank you so much for that. Sarima did an excellent job of helping us put together the agenda, identify the experts and the people that were going to join us. And I'd also like to thank the 3 experts that have facilitated each one of the sessions as well. It's been very insightful, very dense, and I think very, very rich as well. So thank you so much for having joined us as well. I'm gonna share the floor with Janine, who might also have a couple of final words for us. So Janine.
Yeah, no, thank you AEIP for the opportunity for allowing Sarima to partner with you. I think there's been a lot of interesting discussions and questions that have come up over the 4 sessions. And I'm sure if the individual speakers I think most of them have said they don't mind accepting further questions, but you're welcome to direct the questions to me as well, or to Sarima, and then we can take some of those questions offline where we haven't had a chance to answer them during the session.
Fantastic. Thank you, Janine, for that. I'd also like to thank Anna and Martin, who've worked very, very hard over the last 2 months to put together this whole AEIP event, which included the capacity upgrading component. So thank you very much, Anna. Just a quick reminder, we will be sending out a final email providing you with the content and the videos that you can access of the workshop. In that email, we're going to include a link to an online survey, which we really do encourage you to fill out to provide us with any views, feedback, or suggestions or comments on how we could improve our workshops and our capacity upgrading activities in the future. So please do keep an eye out for that. It's going to be very, very important for both the AEIP, the European Commission, as well as for Sarima to hear from you on whether this was useful for you or not. Also a final reminder that there might be other opportunities for you to benefit from in the framework of the AEIP. I think that Janine also mentioned some future training activities that they're organizing, but definitely on the AEIP side, we have additional training activities that are coming up. We're going to be putting a lot of information online, so we encourage you to keep an eye out for that via our website, and don't forget to follow us on social media as well to stay up to date on any future activities that might be of interest to you or your networks. I don't know if Anna, on your end, you had any final words or remarks?
Other than thanking everyone, it has been a pleasure. No additions to that.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Anna. Thanks again to everybody. On behalf of the AEIP, as well as the European Commission, we'd like to thank you very much for having joined us. And we hope to see you soon in one of our future activities. Thanks again, and please do send us your feedback via the online survey. Thanks again, everybody.